Hi everyone, Shemai Bab. I'm Eleanor Leah Williams and I'm currently a PhD candidate at Queen's University Belfast. And my research looks at whether state intelligence during the conflicts in Northern Ireland and Colombia were ethical. But for the next 15 minutes in this masterclass, I'm going to discuss with you why intelligence sometimes fails. So, as a quick overview of today's session, I'll give you a quick introduction to intelligence itself and the intelligence cycle. And then we'll move on to the different ways we can identify an intelligence failure. So let's begin. What is intelligence? And I want you to take a minute to think about what intelligence is, or maybe an example of intelligence in day-to-day life. And hopefully what you will have realised is how broad intelligence really is and how wide-spanning it can be. And whilst the Bond films portray intelligence as something new and shiny, in reality it's much, much older. And it can be seen in the Bible with Judas Iscariot, and there are also ancient records of intelligence in Egypt and China too. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the slogan on public transport saying, "See it, say it, sorted." And even this is a form of intelligence gathering. And in a nutshell, to produce intelligence, data must be collected, and then it's processed, and then it's analysed. Which means data gets collected in the operational environment, which is then processed into information, and then it's finally transformed into intelligence by analysis. So in effect, data is the raw material, and intelligence is the product. And this product is predominantly for governments and military officials. And the intelligence cycle is usually used to explain the concept of intelligence. And the intelligence cycle is comprised typically by 5 stages, which is firstly the planning and direction, then collection of intelligence, then the processing of intelligence, then it's an all-source analysis, and then the intelligence is disseminated. But why is this important? And maybe to understand why it's important that intelligence doesn't fail, it's key to understand why intelligence is important to begin with. So, as Omans and Pythian state, the reasonable justification for any intelligence activity is to acquire information that one believes will improve the quality of decision-making by statesmen, policymakers, military commanders, or even police officers by reducing their ignorance about their operating environment. So better informed decisions lead to better government and a safer and more secure society. And intelligence is also important because states need to know what their friends, enemies are doing. In war, governments need to know what a state's intentions are and battle positions. Within the world of terrorism, intelligence has been key in combating it. Intelligence was vital in the state effort against the IRA between 1969 and 1998. It's also been key in the fight against more recent terrorist groups such as ISIS and the Taliban. And intelligence has also been used to tackle drugs trafficking and organised crime. It shapes foreign policy daily. And there's also environmental intelligence, and that involves monitoring sea levels and levels of emissions and so on. So evidently, intelligence is really important to a state's security and world standing. So, you guessed it, it's really important that it doesn't fail. But sometimes it does fail, and when that happens, the outcomes are terrible. And infamous cases of intelligence failures include Pearl Harbor, the 9/11 attacks, the 7/7 attacks in London, and the more recent terrorist attacks during the past decade in Europe. But how can we identify an intelligence failure? Are failures just inevitable? Surely some just simply slip through the net. Or are there systematic ways that we can identify an intelligence failure? Well, from the intelligence cycle, we can see intelligence failures can arise from inadequate direction, collection, processing, analysis, or dissemination. So basically, if one of these fails, the whole cycle fails. And therefore the intelligence cycle comes under pressure when there's inadequacy of data, lack of information, too much information, or when policymakers have to make a decision under time pressure. For example, failures in collection could include the Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941, and as intelligence historian David Kahn suggests, that there were no intelligence materials, not one intercept, not one datum of intelligence ever said a thing about Pearl Harbor. And similarly, the 9/11 Commission diagnosed analytical failure, and it also identified failures in collection. And these examples highlight to us how the intelligence cycle can be helpful in locating and explaining some intelligence failures. But evidence suggests that this only shows part of the story, and the reality is much more complex than this, so we have to delve a little deeper. And a different approach to understanding intelligence failures is the structural understanding. So that's looking at the organisational context of intelligence agencies and its processes for sharing, challenging, and reviewing intelligence. So, for example, Amy Zegart has identified the reasons for the 9/11 failure, lying in, firstly, cultural pathologies that led intelligence agencies to resist new technologies, ideas, and tasks. Secondly, the preserved promotion incentives that rewarded intelligence officials for just the wrong things. But thirdly, the structural weaknesses dating back decades that hindered the operation of the CIA and FBI and prevented the US intelligence community working as a coherent whole. So basically that you had all these agencies within the US intelligence, but nobody was working together or sharing what they'd found out. So you just had these pockets of intelligence communities, but no one working together. And as exemplified, structural fragmentation hinders communication. So Andrew Sanders agrees with Zegart's concerns over lack of coordination between intelligence agencies. And he actually highlights how damaging and ineffective and inefficient the UK intelligence policy was in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And mainly because of the lack of coordination between intelligence agencies, which prevented the UK effort working as a coherent whole as well. So Sanders criticises the lack of coordination between the UK and the Republic of Ireland too. And according to Sanders, this lack of coordination and cooperation critically impacted the ability of the UK state to counter Republican terrorism in the early 1970s. And Sanders writes there was a really poor relationship between the British Army and the Royal Ulster Constabulary Special Branch, so that's the intelligence wing of the police force in Northern Ireland at the time. And he explains that this was actually down to a lack of trust between the two organisations, and institutional rivalries in intelligence organisations is not unique to the Northern Ireland case study. This is an international problem within the intelligence community. So another approach to understand intelligence failures also comes from Richard Betts, and he's designed this wonderful upside down triangle. And he argues that the responsibility for the most common intelligence failures actually usually lie within the political realm rather than the actual intelligence. So that sometimes structural fixes can't actually prevent failures, according to Betts. And in 1978, Betts wrote that the best known cases of intelligence failure, the most crucial mistakes, have seldom been made by collectors of raw information, occasionally by the professionals who produce the finished analysis, but most often the decision makers who consume the products of intelligence services are responsible. Policy premises constrict the perception, and the administration workloads constrain reflection. So intelligence failure is usually political and psychological, according to Richard Betts. And indeed, Betts has designed this figure of sources of intelligence failures that we have on the screen. And the distinction between intelligence and policy is actually exemplified in Stalin's refusal to believe intelligence that Nazi Germany were preparing to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. And furthermore, the split between intelligence and policy has also been used to explain the failure to anticipate the Argentine invasion of the Falklands Islands in 1982. And according to Gill and Pythian, this sort of intelligence failure is essentially political, in that the failure is primarily not down to the intelligence community, but there's a bit of responsibility on the intelligence community that they haven't been able to convince their policymakers of the validity of its analysis. But Betts focuses on the producer-consumer interface and also hints of another way of thinking about intelligence failure, and that's politicization. And what he means by this is the way in which political pressure sometimes impacts on the intelligence process. And this is a super useful approach, but it's been criticised by many for being kind of poorly defined and conceptualised and not properly operationalised. So there's no doubt it would benefit from greater definitional clarity. And thank goodness Gregory Treverton has suggested 5 different forms that politicisation might take, ranging from hard to soft. And this figure on the screen might help you visualise that. And on the hard end of the scale lies direct pressure from senior figures in government to arrive at a desired conclusion in line with existing policy. And second down we have house line. And that's a dominant assumption emerges, and any challenge to that dominant assumption is regarded as hearsay. And a third form is cherry picking. So this is where senior policy makers select an intelligence that best supports their policy preference from a wider picture presented by overall assessments. And Treverton actually suggests, in regards to the US intelligence on the Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, that policymakers were not content to simply cherry pick, but went as far as to grow their own. And a fourth form, as you can see, is question asking. So this is where any analysis that's not consistent with policy preference is subjected to repeated questioning in a bid to shift it towards the policy preference. And finally, we have on the softer end of the scale is shared mindset. So this is simply where strong presumptions are shared with the policymakers and the intelligence community. And from this, however, arises a legitimate question, which maybe you can think about after this masterclass. And it has no clear answer, but it concerns the appropriate distance and independence that intelligence should have from policy making. And I think highlighting the ambiguity and the nuance of intelligence is a nice place to wrap up today's session. And hopefully that's something that's really come through during this masterclass. And I just want to leave you with a final question for you to think about. And it is, what can we learn from intelligence failures? Or can we learn anything? Are intelligence agencies bound to happen? Or are there ways that they can be stopped? And on that note, I'll pass you back to the host for instructions on the next step. Diolch yn fawr am gwrando. Many thanks for listening.